Yeah, look, I think you need to understand why you're doing this. What's it about business process management that you believe will change your organisation's path, its life?
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Well, welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And in each of these episodes, I get the absolute privilege of sitting down with process practitioners. So those that are currently day in and day out putting business process management practice in their organizations, delivering real tangible value in the organizations that they're working in to meet their strategic objectives. And that's what process management is all about. It's trying to help the organization meet their strategic objectives. And if it's not, then what's the point? So in today's conversation, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Tim Wrathall. Now, Tim is a business analysis and change practice manager at Transurban currently, has worked in a range of different organizations and has a ton of experience as well, networked with the wider business analysis community. So lots of experience to glean from here. Really excited for this conversation. Tim, thanks for joining me.
Daniel, great. Thank you for having me.
So because the name of the podcast is Process Pioneers, so very much focused on business process management, where does that fit into, I guess, this broad range of topics that you're associated with, you're involved in?
So I see business process management as yet another way of articulating and eliciting requirements and understanding how a business operates in order to understand how we currently do things, where pain may reside within an organisation, and how we can go about addressing that to deliver business value. So I've been a very strong supporter of business process management over the 20 plus years in my IT career, and more focused in the last 10 years when I undertook my first assignment in BPM. I first had to this was with a major water utility in Melbourne. And I first had to understand really what the art and essence of process management was. I worked on workflows and I could understand the basic shapes, but really we need to sort of understand what the value that we wanted to try and create here, what was the proposition. And so this is just going beyond just building a simple process repository or a set of maps for people, but understanding how those things interlinked and understanding what that looked like against an organisational process model. So there's many examples of how you can do that. But ultimately, this came back to our users, and we needed to understand we can put this beautiful process map together, but at the same time, what values is going to give to them? How is it going to make their life easier? And, the first thing that struck me is that if they need to read this every day, there's something deficient in their role. But, notwithstanding that, I think as a business analysis practitioner, what this helps us do is really understand how the business works and operates so we can make valuable change. But if we need to come back and make amendments to a system or a business process, we've got a base set and a base understanding of how everything works rather than having to recreate this every single time. And, for me, having that sort of power of information at your fingertips is such a great thing. And now it's sort of evolving to other things where we're seeing more of an alignment of data and process, which I think will be very important. I can talk to more about later in the interview as well. But, there's so much intrinsic power in here that we can get from good business process management, and it can add a lot of value to the organisation to help them meet their strategic objectives.
Great. And so I guess going back over the past 10 years, it's obviously clicked for you. It made sense for you. What's it been like with other stakeholders in the organisation, whether it's the people on the front lines where their process is actually changing, or the senior leaders where maybe process is a different management approach that they hadn't been sort of exposed to before?
Yeah, look, this is a really good question. And, I'm often struck with this. And again, it's come up over time when developing process maps. It should be for all audiences. It shouldn't just be necessarily for the senior management who will get a different type of value to someone who works at the front line. I still recall a story back when we were sort of doing our first process maps and we had an org process model. It all looked great. But people said, I already know how to do this. So there was not necessarily value to him. But what we did as a part of that process is augment key tasks. And one of them was a report that he had to run on a regular basis. Always found it difficult to find. But once we could annotate that process with that link to that report, that made his life easier. So there was value delivered. So it can be just the small little wins like that, which are fantastic. But, from a strategic perspective, looking at this when we're making decisions about system investment or where, we wish to make change in an organisation, that can also be very powerful as well. So building something at scale that can be used by and consumed by multiple audiences is very important to me, and I think is a very important tenet of good business process management.
Yeah, great. And you mentioned a couple of different drivers there, like motivations for an organisation to adopt process management. Do you find that it is quite varied, or do you find that there are oftentimes 1, 2, or 3 main drivers why an organisation will want to understand and manage their processes better?
Sure, great question. Yeah, look, I think the key things I've seen over the years in working in business process management, quality of service through consistent, repeatable processes is often something that's discussed a lot. How can we do this? How can we scale simply, or how can we build a new product line using the same sort of process structure and scale that quickly? So to me, that's always coming up as a topic and something that people are very keen on looking at. It's also a driver for continuous improvement, and I leaned on this before about the sort of the 2B states. Once you've got that base model in there, it's very I won't say simple, but it's much easier to be able to deploy ideas and explore new things from a means of continuous improvement. And certainly with a very tough market, Transurban, where I work at the moment, is not immune to sort of the pressures that we've seen over the last few years through COVID and the like. So we need to be responsive and agile to market conditions. And, having that sort of process information allows us to be able to make quick decisions without having to go through a lot of extra research or analysis. And for organisations where compliance and safety and all those sort of things are very important, having these processes supporting or even embedded in management systems can be also useful as well. And they're the sort of 4 key things that really come up for me on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. And because we have quite a diverse audience that listens to this podcast, and there would be some listeners from organisations that are at the very early stages of their BPM journey, very low level of process maturity. For those organisations that do want to, make it more of a priority and start to manage their processes better, where do you start?
Yeah, look, I think you need to understand why you're doing this. What's it about business process management that you believe will change your organisation's path, its life? Are you looking to reduce cost? Are you looking to become more compliant? Are you looking to get a competitive advantage in the market? And once those sort of drivers are understood, we need to understand what the model will do for the organisation in order to meet those goals. Okay, so if it's sort of a cost-saving exercise, having an understanding of the processes and then diving into that and using it to identify waste or identify pain points or duplications, that can help get quick wins in order to improve an organisation. For sort of trying to sort of get a market or a competitive advantage, having that repeatable process means that you've got a really, I'd say an 80% model ready to go for a new product line, and then you can make the 20% of adjustments based on new learnings, market nuances, or whatever that may be. So again, that can take a lot of the legwork out of getting to market very quickly. And from a compliance perspective as well, safety, is obviously very important in many organisations. So having that information there and, meeting compliance, but making sure that, people go home every day is very important. So having repeatable processes for people to follow through training or, exercise or, when they're doing their daily work, I think is also very important as well. So there's many benefits that can be gained from having a good process model.
Yeah, great. And when it comes to the effort versus the return, because I think that's obviously one thing that the senior leaders will care about is, if we put X amount of dollars in, what does that mean? And it's not always about the return you get. As you mentioned there, safety is a big thing, compliance is a big thing. But what is possible? Do you have a couple of stories or examples of where you've been involved in certain process initiatives and it has delivered, results, whether it was achieving the defined target or going above and beyond what was expected? Do you have some examples? Because I think for some of the audience there, they don't have these, tangible real life stories that they can promote in their organization. And so they're looking at who else is doing this and what are they achieving basically?
Yeah. One that always resonates with me is working in a large organization. They delivered a lot of products and services, but just for sort of different work streams. And we initiated our process improvement journey with them, and we started with the first group and understood how they conducted their steps from A to Z, which made sense. Worked with another similar business unit and understood their steps, and there's a few similarities there. That's very interesting. And then worked with the third business unit, and we. Yeah, aside from sort of some data point changes, it was a very similar process. And for years, we'd been told and believed to understand that, we're very unique. We need to do things differently. But when we got them all back in the room, we put their processes side by side, but removed the names and said, okay, these are the processes that we understood. And without having the names in there, they couldn't immediately identify which was theirs. But the trick here was that they were almost identical. In how they were executed. And it was just some data point changes that we discovered that said, well, you're actually not that unique. We can standardize this a lot more to make your life easier by taking out some of the waste here, but making it bespoke enough to sort of understand any very unique needs. And they weren't huge. At the time, they did very similar things, it's just in different work streams. But, that understanding that process structure means we could actually cut down some of the waste within the system as well. And so it made that more efficient to run. But ultimately, it made their life easier because they had a shared understanding of how they could do their work. And it also helped with growth opportunities. I recall a story where someone from one team, because they understood the processes for all, could easily move into another team. So there's a training and development opportunity and a personal growth opportunity for people if you can sort of standardize these things within your team as well.
Mm-hmm. So is it more important to start on that sort of higher level bird's eye view process architecture, or is it, because I know different organizations will be focused on, rather either the architecture, the hierarchy, or the detailed sort of BPMN process maps? What's more important as a starting point?
Yeah, look, this is a great question, and it's asked me all the time. It's, do you go bottom up, which is that sort of BPMN process field, or go top down? Look, both are applicable and both work. I've worked in both environments where we've started with top down and sort of, done the sort of functional decomposition to understand how the business worked and build processes from there. But then it was also sort of user-led drives to say, look, we want to understand our process more, so we want to do a bottom-up feed. And look, for people that are wondering which is the best, well, both can work. It all depends on your unique organizational circumstance. The best advice there is, two things: making these process maps matter. Making sure that people get them. They can understand the value that they're going to get from using those process flows, and understand the power that they can derive from it. And also not making it too overwhelming as well. So you can often go, if you go sort of top down, you can go too far down the rabbit hole, so to speak, where you might overanalyze a process and it gets to a point where the value that you're trying to get from that process sort of falls away a little bit. So it's a real art and a science, and sometimes a bit of luck as well, to understand what's the right level to get to. So that'll come with experience. So having a good process practitioner in the organisation who understands the structure, and understand structures from other organisations as well will certainly help. One bit of advice I can give in a couple of organisations I work with, we've used. I don't believe in best practice frameworks. I believe in better practice frameworks. So it's just mindset really. But we've worked with the what's known as the process classification framework, which is administered by the American Process Quality Consortium, and it's sometimes a little bit viewed as a little bit dated, and it's a very overwhelming document. But what it is a really good straw man to understand what a base structure will look like in an organisation, what a better practice structure looks like in other organisations and industries as well. But having said that to people, if I was to feed that document directly to a business unit or an executive, I would have some very glazed eyes very quickly. So
right.
what I'm very careful to do is try and relate that back to the organisation. And I've talked a few times today about the organisational process model. The real trick is making what the organisational view looks like, what your value streams look like, and tying that back to a best practice model to see this is how we sort of stack up against what peers in the industry may look like, how there's views from our business as well, and how they understand how these things hang together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. And I'd imagine that, like, working in such large organisations, there are many people to bring along the journey, and potentially many people to present themselves as obstacles or sort of hurdles to what you're trying to achieve. And you're obviously very, very much involved in change management as well. How does change management, I guess, complement business process management? How do they work hand in hand? Because I know some people are, business process focused and maybe less with less attention on the bringing the people along.
Yeah. Look, it's a great question. It's again the leverage of other practices that we have within the organisation. I'm just lucky I get to lead both of them for my current organisation. There's a couple of key things that I can get from change management which can help business process management and improvement. Understanding stakeholders and understanding their unique needs and what the value proposition looks like to them and what they're looking for. Communications is particularly important as well. So making sure that the message is clear and how we understand the process and how that any change may be communicated to them as well. So keeping people in the loop regularly is good. And also that business readiness as well. So if we're going to make a change to a business process, we have a good structure in place to explain what that change looks like, what the impact will be to them and when it's actually going to happen, and providing that follow-up support as well. So those sort of three, there are other things that may be important, but they're the sort of things that I've seen to me very useful over the time. Stakeholder relationships is absolutely so key in this as well, and all of those three domains talk to that as well. Making sure people are understood, they're heard. You might not be able to solve every problem, and that's just part of the course of what we do in our industry. But at the same time, if someone's at least heard and they're understood, then they might not necessarily get the outcome they're after. They at least feel validated that, this guy's actually listened to me. They might be able to do something in the future for us.
Yeah. And are there any sort of key sort of mistakes you see practitioners making when it comes to embarking on the process management journey that you see time and time again?
Yeah, look, a lot of it's around buy-in, and I think we need to be clear about how this can represent value to an organisation and how it can make their job easier. We need to make any sort of process repositories or models that we use easy to use. Otherwise, people just go around it or make their own off-model system with Visio. But the things that probably scare decision makers the most, cost is a big one. So how much time and money do you wish to invest in maintaining and establishing a business process repository? I can say they're not cheap, but if you set up habits and practices early on in the piece, it can be fairly cost efficient, yet also deliver value to the organisation. Language is also important as well. So I've had comments in the past that I don't get all this flowchart stuff, and fair enough. I don't necessarily get what you do as a from your technical expertise, but at the same time, what my job is here to make it easy for you so you can consume that. And I used that report example before. I I'm on a process with 60 tasks in it, multiple gateways, start stops everywhere, all that sort of stuff. But all he wanted to see was that particular report on the process. And once I could show him that, then he understood it and then sort of gone, look, we can maybe make some changes to this process. So it gives time, gives some people the opportunity to immerse themselves in that process flow. They will get it after time. They don't have to be perfect from day one. That's your job as a practitioner to make that life easier for them. And, again, the big one always comes back to value. Why change anything if it's not going to deliver value? So you really need to ask the question, how will this help me sell more X or of Y? Or how will this make my customer happy? How will this increase NPS? So this is coming back to your motivations and drivers. And this is what should be spurring you as you go through your business process management journey. Understanding that very clearly from the get-go, reviewing that regularly to make sure that aligns with org strategy and direction, and then implementing changes required, but always using that sort of as your guiding light, I think is really important.
Yeah. And you mentioned there about sort of, communicating it clearly in a way that all people can understand it, whether they fully grasp the flowchart concept or not, making sure that people are on the same page. Because I guess that there's a lot of knowledge there to leverage in the organisation. You've got people on the front line doing different roles and tasks and activities that will be able to identify pain points, problems, challenges better than someone that isn't doing that stuff day in and day out. So I guess, if we as practitioners, if we can create an environment where they feel heard, they own their process and they can see the importance of that change, then we should expect to have some fantastic sort of ideas and suggestions and thoughts coming to the table that we can work with. We're not obviously just going to make changes for anybody and everyone, because as the practitioners, we need to see, I guess, the full picture, the big picture, the upstream, the downstream. If we do make this change, what else is that going to impact? What systems is that going to impact? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's particularly important as well. One thing I didn't note before, with languages and how you communicate this information, it's really important to sort of keep it simple. Now, we can talk about the business process modeling notation, which is probably the industry standard, and it's something that I've personally used for a number of years, and I think it's great. Probably a couple of its biggest flaw, though, is it's got a number of different reference points, a number of different objects you can use, and I think plus 200. Using all of them in front of a business user who may not be sort of exposed to that is probably very daunting. So to keep things very simple and maybe not use some of the fancy stuff initially and then start to build that once people get more confidence with the language is probably a safe way to go as well. And, some really sort of easy sort of framing stuff like verb noun constructs within tasks and not trying to write out a whole work instruction in a box. Is always a very popular one as well. Those are little simple things. And again, it's about keeping things simple. And you can then scale that once there's more of an organisational knowledge with it. It all comes down to, mind over matter in that sort of regard, I think. So.
Yeah, definitely. And so you've done all this work. You've brought people along for the journey. You have that buy-in and sponsorship. One thing that I've seen in the past is when key people move on and all of a sudden it's almost like process goes out the window in some cases and there are some very notable organisations here in Australia even that business process management was such a significant part of how they managed their organisation, led from the top down, from the CEO. But as soon as that key person left the organisation and maybe a few others as well, all of a sudden, we're not doing a process thing anymore. We're doing agile, or we're doing, some other sort of approach or methodology. How do we avoid that from happening when we do maybe the original sort of initiator of this approach leaves or moves on? What do we need to do to make sure we're set up for sustained success?
Yeah, and that's a real key point there, Daniel, in that sustained success, and I'm very keen on seeing that in organisations. Now, I remember in one large org that I worked in, the business process improvement manager once said to me, "Tim, I should be able to do myself out of a job with the work that I do." And I initially said, "Okay, what's that all about?" I'm not sure. I said, "I should be able to get this organisation to a level of process efficiency where I have no more work to do and I can move on." And I thought about it and thought, that's actually a really good mindset to do. I think we need to have strong succession planning in there, in that the businesses become the owners of the process. And that fits right into your governance structure as well, in that you need to make sure the businesses are owning this process, maintaining it, rather than it just being another IT geeky thing. It needs full business ownership. to maintain that. And I've found good, effective governance models work around business ownership, and then teams like your business analysis, your architecture practices work together to set up the sort of delivery assurances framework, the quality standards, what notation looks like, the training and support to get people to the right level in order to be able to have an organisational consciousness about it. So that business buy-in and support is paramount to success. I think if that's lacking, you will struggle to have a successful business process management and improvement initiatives within the organisation. So it must be one of the first things that you think about in terms of your objectives. And it actually may be multiple owners. That can effectively work as well. But I think there needs to be the shared understanding of the goals and what we're trying to achieve with this. People might have, say, customer might have a different view to what engineering might have, and that's perfectly fine as well. But there's got to be a shared understanding of continuous improvement, as an example. If that can be found between multiple parties, I think we're in a good spot as well.
Yeah, great. And I've noticed over the last couple of years there's been very much a sort of a shift, or I don't know if you'd call it a shift, but it's definitely a move towards more of a customer journey focus, more of a customer experience focus. Talk to us a little bit about that, and because you've obviously got the experience from the external perspective, the customer's perspective. Then you've got all of those internal business processes that's supporting that. How do those two things work hand in hand together under this practice?
Look, great questions. And I think the customer journey and understanding the customer experience really helps us identify where the value is that they're looking for. And I think that both can work in unison, whether it be multiple imprints on a customer journey that may be governed by one or many processes as well. I think making sure we get that clear alignment between what happens on the value stream and what happens on a customer journey, and how a business process and data especially will support that customer journey and add value to that experience and ultimately delight our customers. So I think it's incumbent upon people who are maybe a journey expert or whatever it's defined in an organisation, make sure they work hard together to get that alignment and make sure it's continually maintained to make sure it's relevant and make sure it's important as well. I think the two forces there are very complementary of each other as well, and can add a lot of benefit to an organisation. Yeah,
and I guess these days with such a disruptive business landscape and environment, where and as consumers we're interacting with many different organisations every single day, whether we realise it or not. We're interacting with different organisations, whether that's private or government, or public, whatever it might be, our financial institutions, the utility companies that supply water and electricity to our houses, things like that. And I guess subconsciously we are engaging in different experiences. And but what's not subconscious is when we go through a poor experience, or we're liaising or working with an organisation where we're forced to go through loops, or we get this feeling like where our time's being wasted. We come off the phone with maybe a bank where we get a seamless experience, and then we're on the phone with our local government or something like that, where it doesn't seem as seamless. And I feel like as consumers, we're naturally going to be drawn and attracted to those organisations that are, I guess, have taken the friction away out of that sort of interaction with them.
Yes. Look, those channels that we interact with our businesses are so important as well. And clearly over the last 10 or 15 years, we've had a significant renaissance in digital platforms, making our lives a lot more easier and a lot more accessible as well. And I can't imagine a world without internet banking, being able to pay my bills with companies. There's a lot of benefit that those sort of channels can provide as well. But those channels can only work effectively if they're not only supported by understanding the customer journey, but processes that support how they work to make to cut down the waste in those processes, make them efficient, make sure the data is available, and where we understand data as a value object in that as well. So one of the things that I'm very keen on is this idea of SIPOC, or supplier input, process, customer and output. What this to me denotes is, okay, how can a task change a bit of data and how can it add value? And immediately when you see it changing, transitioning a piece of data to add benefit to a customer, that's fantastic. But when it doesn't, when it goes into a task and does nothing, it's just more of a holding pattern. You've got to go, is that adding value? Is there potential waste in that as well? So, understanding those processes that support the customer journey as well is going to be very important. And I see that is a really big frontier in the new world where we've probably been very comfortable with drawing processes and even advancements in some modelling using better parts of BPMN. But I think a lot more organisations now are not so into implementing big systems, but more about getting these systems to talk. And process can really drive that as well. And underpinning that is that relationship of data and how that data will add value across the process to make those systems talk, to present that information to customers that will ultimately make their life easier and their interactions with organisations much easier as well. Say look at a utility, whether it be water, power, that doesn't really matter. Ultimately, there should be minimal interactions, ideally only just 4 interactions per year to pay your quarterly bill. There will be other times when you need to call them for connections, disconnections, faults and the like. And those processes should be very simple. But ideally for the average user, if those 4 touch points can be absolutely seamless and almost minimalist, I think you're going to have very happy customers.
Yeah, definitely. And now when you look towards the future, I mean, you've already mentioned a couple of things like data being sort of integrated with the way we manage our processes. But I guess what sort of trends are you noticing? What does the next 5 years of business process management look like? Obviously, there are organizations that are still at a lower level of maturity and they still need to get some of the foundational sort of things in place. And there are other organizations that are more at the cutting edge and they're diving into new technologies to see how they can support the work they're doing, whether that's, process mining or robotic process automation or different technologies like that. But what trends are you noticing and what does the future look like?
Yeah, look, data and process, as you mentioned, very key thing, and it really needs to be at the forefront of all decision making. I talk about being a big fan of SIPOC, and I know it seems it can be a bit overwhelming to people, but I think that it's going to be very important, and understanding how data works and how that can add value, intertwined with the process to add value, is going to be very important. And also think embedding business process management and improvement in all levels of decision making is, for me, going to be very important moving forward. Whether that be from a strategic level and understanding our functions and capabilities, all the way down to how we make tactical and operational decisions, and how good process management can support that as well. So embedded across all levels of decision making. I guess examples where I've seen in organisations, it's either been heavily weighted at the lower levels or more weighted at the higher levels. Now, what I'm wanting to see more is both levels at an equal sort of par and working well and harmoniously to make organisations better.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. And for those that are listening, that, this has been a very sort of jam-packed 30-minute diving into a couple of topics and touching on a couple of different areas. And I'm sure that, I've been gleaning a lot from this conversation. I'm sure you've piqued the interest of people that are listening to this. Where do they go to learn more? Because for some of the audience, they are somewhat isolated. They don't have a wide community of practitioners to network with. So where do they go to continue this learning and this support so that they can bring the value into their organisation?
Yeah, look, great question. It first struck me when I first started is, where do I begin with all this process journey? And for me, and from an Australian focus initially, the International Institute of Business Analysts, or the IABA, was an excellent source. And I've had a long relationship with the organisation, and now being a part of the board of directors in Australia, I get to see firsthand how we can make differences to BA communities in providing networks or communities of practice for people to be able to build their knowledge. There's other things such as events and certification and the like, but there's a really good base community there that we can leverage upon and glean knowledge about how we can use practical examples of business process management improvement in organisations. And that may lead to other things as well. Some of the initiatives that we're starting to look at are more specialised workshops on process mapping or user stories or whatever that may be. So there's certainly opportunities there in the future, and that'll certainly come. And if people are interested in that, I'd advise them to keep an eye on the IBA Australia website for future opportunities. But I've mentioned a couple of times in the session today the American Process Quality Consortium, or the APQC. So this has been a really great library of reference information to me over the years. And it is, again, a good place to start from the object management group as well. So there's some good information in there to be able to provide base references on what models and standards look like and how you actually use some of these objects and shapes in delivering your process maps. If you're ever not sure how to best use them, this is the guide to be able to get that information from. So it's more like the library that you will go to, and something like the IBA is a user community in Australia and globally, of course, can provide more practical ways of how it's used by practitioners for businesses all across Australia and the world.
Great. And if they have if the audience has questions for yourself or want to, I guess, follow along your journey, how would they best do that?
Look, if they want to, if people like to get in contact with me and talk about all things process management or business analysis or change or testing as it may be, I'm on LinkedIn, so just search for Tim Wrathall. Happy to have a conversation and help out my community with improving themselves and asking questions and getting advice. I seldomly blog. I don't have a lot of time, unfortunately, to share these stories, but, I'm always up for a conversation and always available to sort of, talk with people, like-minded individuals who are looking to not only improve themselves, but improve their position in organisations and, how we can use the power of business process management to make our lives better.
Great. That's awesome. Well, as I said, I've gleaned a lot from this conversation. So I just want to thank you, Tim, for catching up with me today. I'm sure the audience has gleaned a lot from you as well. So, yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for having me. And it's been absolutely wonderful.